thank you everybody for joining us for this talk, the playbook behind Wednesday's Domaine's biggest ever month. My name is James. I run Brand Hackers. We're a marketing agency that work with founder-led brands across lots of different consumer categories, from food and drink through to pet care, wellness, home, and everything else in between. And we've been going for about 5 years, working with various brands. Today we're talking about one of the brands that we work with and have worked with for about 3 years. That is Wednesday's Domaine. It's a non-alcoholic wine brand, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because I'm going to let the man himself, the founder of that, Luke Hemsley, who's very kindly joined us to talk through the various growth of the brand. So I'll let him introduce the brand properly. We've also got Jean-Luc, who's in our growth team and leads the growth on the Wednesday's Domaine account, and so he's going to be going into some of the detail and getting really stuck into the ins and outs of what we've been doing over the last year, which is an interesting year where we've really scaled up our work with Wednesday's Domaine. Thanks so much for joining us. Like I say, we'd love to hear from you, so pop your name and what you do in the chat if you can, and we'll be doing a Q&A in about half an hour after Jean-Luc's been through some slides. So we would love to get questions from you. So as we go, pop your questions in there. I'm going to keep an eye and make sure that they all get answered and asked and answered. So please, please don't be strangers. Right, let me come on to you, Luke. Luke, thanks so much for joining us. Luke Hemsley, founder of Wednesday's Domaine. Luke, we actually met a few years ago, back in 2021. I was looking at this and I share this the deck, and let me see. So there you go. We met at a supper club when Upworld, which is a sister company to Brand Hackers, used to be called Copy Club, and we used to run these supper clubs where we get founders in a room, and we would I guess get people who are at a similar stage or in the building their brand, and get them in a room together and bash some heads and have some nice dinner, and hopefully some good stuff came out. So there's an old photo I found there of Luke looking like you're holding court, I would say, and keeping the room entertained, which is fantastic. And then that was the first time we met, and then a couple of years later you got in touch with us and said, look, we're looking for some brand management support, and that was where our journey started back in June 2023. And we started working with Wednesday's Domaine. So 3 years almost, and that team's evolved a lot. So Luke, can you start by a little bit about Wednesday's Domaine, about the kind of the evolution of the brand over the past 3 or 4 years, and give it a bit of an intro, so we've got a bit of context to start us off, please.
Yeah, of course, and thanks for that introduction, James. As for the photo, I think if you look carefully, everyone seems to be looking the other way or otherwise engaged. So clearly, I wasn't holding court too successfully, which hasn't really changed over the last few years. The first thing to say is thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join. I know you're all super busy. Half of you are probably in the middle of your lunch. So we will try and make this as interesting, as engaging, as useful as possible. As James says, I'm the founder of Wednesday's Domaine. It's a business that I set up 3 or 4 years ago now. And it was really in response to a personal experience of mine. So I've actually spent the 7 or 8 years prior working in early stage startups. I realized quite early on in my career that I wanted to set up a business. At the time, I was a commodities trader, which is possibly the worst way to go about learning how to set up a business. And so quickly made that transition across into startups. And after those 7 or 8 years, largely working in tech businesses, I realized that the types of businesses I loved, the types of businesses I admired, had 2 things in common. They were rooted in physical products and delightful customer experiences. And that gave me the lens through which to look at opportunities, to look at the types of businesses I might one day hope to set up. That realization happened to overlap with some time spent with my parents, with my wife's parents during COVID. Like a lot of people, we kind of escaped our tiny London flat. Very fortunately, I managed to spend time with a little bit more space. And most evenings we would have a drink. That was really how we delineated day from night. That was an experience that is common to probably a lot of people on this call. And I realized quite quickly that I was drinking, not excessively, but in a way that I definitely wouldn't be in the real world. I was having a beer, a couple of glasses of wine most evenings, and realized that it wasn't really compatible with still having to work hard, albeit remotely, staying mentally and physically fit, all that sort of stuff. And so went and looked at some alcohol-free options. When I went to the supermarket, Beers, spirits, there were loads of them. They looked great and they tasted great. When it came to wine, that just wasn't the case at all. Very few options. They really didn't look great. They were emblazoned with 0.0 or very proudly non-alcoholic, and they tasted even worse. So naively figured there was a gap for a great tasting, beautifully branded alcohol-free wine. Naively thought it can't be that hard. Turns out it's incredibly hard on lots and lots of different levels, from a product through to a distribution standpoint, through to kind of category awareness and appreciation view. And actually started that journey with someone who's on the call right now. I can see them looking back at me, Hugh Duffy, who's doing some work with Cowshed at the minute. Hugh really helped me kind of structure my thinking and helped set up the website and our initial Klaviyo flows and all that sort of stuff. And that's really, really relevant, because all of my energy went into how do we create the brand, how do we create the product. I didn't even think, to my eternal embarrassment, how do we then sell it? How do we get it to market? I'd never even heard the phrase go to market, GTM. So I hadn't really even thought about that. And initially I thought, well, we'll sell it to a few restaurants, sell it to a few wine shops. And that then turned into quite a structured plan as to how we would advance the business, continue to kind of develop those sales relationships and really grow things. The next thing is, where did brand hackers come in? Hugh and I had been doing that for a bit. We were writing a newsletter called Table Talk, which celebrated the kind of slightly obscene, meandering conversations we have around dinner table with friends and family. We were running a few meta ads. I think they were pretty horrendous, pretty terrible. No one really clicked on them, but we were just working it out. And it was around that time that I got in touch with Lottie, got in touch with James, and said, we need a bit of support. I don't really know what it looks like. I know where we're struggling. I know where I feel there might be some opportunities. Can you come back to me with a bit of a menu of services, and let's have a look at what that can look like? Because one of the things that I'm struck by over and over again when it comes to marketing roles is that they're often quite siloed, and skill sets are often quite niche. And a great SEO person isn't necessarily a great designer, and a designer doesn't really understand meta ads. And so actually that's where businesses of our stage at that point in time can benefit enormously from agency relationships. So I'll stop there, but that's a bit of context around me, the business, and how we first started working with brand hackers.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The first thing we did with Wednesday's Domain was to take on more of the brand side of things, brand management, copywriting, and that kind of thing. And actually, I think the context to set us up for Jean-Luc's presentation here is about, I'd say 18 months ago, Luke and I were having coffee in Tooting, and we were talking about kind of the direction of travel for Wednesday's Domain in terms of their distribution, in terms of their route to market, and kind of where that focus would be. And you know, I think Luke sort of looked at the DC, which was at the time quite a small part of the business, and said, look, I actually think there's something here. And I can't remember exactly the products you named, but you know, there was a product you were like, if they can sell this much of a like random cleaning product or something like that, imagine how much wine we could be selling online, you know, if we really went for it. And that was actually the start of where we then built out a growth team for Luke. And that's what we've been doing for the past sort of 15 months. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But Luke, can you kind of quickly give us a bit of context on was it a light bulb moment? Was it driven by the market, or what was your thinking to really get a bit more serious about performance and D2C?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, whether they're running a business or in a role, often you're kind of quietly assimilating information, and then all of a sudden something hits you and you can't not think about it. And for me, that was the opportunity with D2C. And I hadn't really quite connected the dots between how scalable ad spend and revenues could be, and relatively linear in that respect, which is both a good and a bad thing. But the reason I like D2C is it's one of the few things in the commercial side of any scaling FMCG business that you can control. Everyone wants to get into supermarkets. Everyone wants to work with big, interesting groups, but you can't control that. They have very infrequent kind of listing windows. Someone may not like your product, and ultimately you just have to keep banging on that door, but it might be 1, 2, 3 years before you can do that. D2C essentially acts as a national listing from day one. And I think that's probably a phrase that I borrowed from Hugh back in the day. You know, whether you live in Inverness or you live in Penzance, we can get you a bottle of Wednesday's Domain within a day or two. it's fantastic for brand building. You really can engage people in what makes you unique as a brand, in your tone of voice, how you see the world. It also it gives you, if you look at what's going on within wine, when it comes to alcohol-free wine, I strongly believe that the consumer, there's latent consumer demand there. It's largely unmet by the place that people buy the bulk of their wine, which is in supermarkets. So if consumers are underserved by the supermarkets, there's an outsized opportunity in D2C. British consumers have displayed a willingness at scale to buy wine online through people like Naked Wines, the Wine Society, Majestic. It's already happening. It's an ingrained existing behavior. So all we had to do was tap into that. And then the kind of secondary benefits are that through D2C, you can cash flow a lot of your business. We put our Meta ads on a credit card, we pay it off in 45 days on average, the cash drops into your bank account plus 2-3 days out of Shopify. So there's this really nice kind of inversion of your cash conversion cycle, which is the very unsexy piece of it, but actually super, super relevant. And as you start to scale your ads, you get these secondary benefits of buyers beginning to get in touch with you, saying, look, you guys are chasing me around the internet, I've got to get in touch with you. And actually, we are getting listings now inbound from buyers that I've probably emailed them or their colleagues upwards of 20, 30 times. And now, through that social media presence, people are getting in touch with us. And so there's benefits that exist beyond the numbers that show up on a day-to-day basis in your sales.
That's amazing. I love that. I'm taking those 3 nuggets, and I'm gonna put a LinkedIn post around that. Really, really cool. Let's bring Jean-Luc into the conversation and hand over the reins to him. Jean-Luc, thanks for joining us. Jean-Luc in our growth team, has been for the past three years, and has been on the Wednesday Domaine account for about 18 months, maybe. And so he's going to be talking us through how the journey over the past 12 to 15 months and what that looks like. So I'll pass over to you, Jean-Luc, and I will drive the deck for you.
Thank you very much. Everyone's going to be hearing me say next slide a lot, so apologies in advance. Also, some familiar faces in the chat. Claudia, who is one of our content creators who helps us work on some beautiful ads for Wednesday's Domain, is in the chat. There she is with a love heart. You're featured at various points throughout this presentation, which may be a surprise to you, so I hope you look forward to that as well. So yeah, the growth story on D2C for Wednesday's Domain, we have to talk about Meta, essentially. So around 2/3, around the 2/3 mark of Wednesday's Domain's D2C revenue is driven or closely attributed to Meta. And so what I thought I would do over the next few slides is give a little bit of a timeline, a little bit of a backstory to kind of the growth we've seen both over the last 12 months in particular, especially the really strong dry Jan we had. And what I'm hoping to do is make it really useful to everyone here. So I'm not going to get too technical. These are more strategic things we're considering, how we're approaching the biggest lever at the minute on Meta, which is ad creative. And so, as James said, any questions in the chat as we go along, we'll come to those at the end. So to kick off, I guess the background context of 2025, which obviously preceded 2026's dry Jan, was that on Meta, it was a big year of scaling and growth and very consistent growth. So we increased spend by around 317, I say around as if that's not a really accurate number, by 317% throughout the year. Revenue increased by just under 210%. And obviously during that time, I want to be really upfront that as you scale to such a degree like that, you are going to see some upward drift in CAC. And as we'll come on to in the later slides, it's about how you manage that in terms of communicating with Luke and founders and making sure that what's going on paid makes commercial sense. But I don't want to be any illusions that you can, 3x your ad spend and have CAC stay completely stable. That said, if you go on to the next slide, please, James, what was really exciting. Is there a lag for me? Oh, there we go. What was really exciting about the results that we saw in dry Jan in particular was that we were able to drive, I mean, if you look at that last section of that graph, some really, I need a better adjective, but some really crazy, impressive results whilst keeping CAC relatively stable on Meta month on month. So just to put a few more numbers to this, so between, I guess, following on from that already big year of growth, we've scaled ad spend by a further 110% month on month, and then that led to a revenue increase of 99% month on month, again, whilst keeping CAC almost identical within that time frame as well. Next slide, please, James. Thank you. So this is a fun graph. I will be getting it made into a poster at some point because it's a fun one. What this is really helpful to do is kind of show the meta growth of the last 2 years. So this is total purchases, which I think gives a good indicator of the growth that we saw and kind of the pattern that we've seen. So what the main takeaway I want everyone to leave here with today is that when you nail creative strategy on Meta at the moment, and when you really spend time investing in that, it doesn't just add to your results, it acts as a multiplier. And so you can see there pretty consistent growth throughout the last 2 years, but when peak period of dry Jan, which is obviously hugely important for Wednesday's Domain, met the work that we'd been doing in terms of creative pipeline and professionalizing and expanding that's when you get this real runaway moment and results are multiplied. It's not just that dry Jan is then giving us some additional sales as well. So if you just go on to the next slide, please, James, I can say a little bit more about that. So circled here is kind of Q4 into dry Jan of 2025, and you can see there is a natural increase in volume of sales here. Some of this is through scaling budgets, some of it is through demand being higher through Q4, but what you can really see is that although there's a pretty big spike from that October to the Jan, there's not this huge runaway moment. And the reason for this is because, yes, we were investing in creative, yes, we were optimizing and obviously zoomed in on this. Performance at the time was solid and we were happy with it. But what we didn't have yet was this vast creative, I guess, infrastructure and bandwidth to fully seize the opportunity and get this multiplication effect. So if you go on to the next slide, please, James. Whereas what was different this time, we had a very systematized, repeatable, reproducible approach to creative. We'd been investing in that throughout the year, and so that meant in this dry Jan, there's a motivational quote, something about opportunity meeting circumstance or something like that. It was very much one of those moments where we were seeing the results and we were like, oh, we can really be pushing harder because of all this work that we've been doing in the back end. So again, over the coming slides, I'll dive into a little bit more about what that looked like. Perfect timing, Dave. Thank you. So what we did. So I mentioned here, you're probably sick of hearing it, but this was driven by creative. I think I've said the word creative about 45 times already in this presentation. But creative strategy is the backbone of what led to this growth on Meta. But what I don't want people to feel is like creative strategy is this kind of black box, or it's something that you need infinite resource to do. Obviously, most people, if not everyone in this call, works in a startup or scale up. Resources are limited. So to give some context about the resources we had at our disposal in terms of strictly my time on Meta ads. So this was around 1 day per week. When I first joined Wednesday's Domain about 2 years ago, it was around half a day, and then at some point in that 18-month window that James and Luke just mentioned, we went up to 1 day to kind of match demand. But obviously within this time, having finite time as someone fractional in the team, or even if you're a founder running your ads, your time is spread so thinly between all the aspects of the brand. You have to know what is important and where to spend that time when it comes to Meta ads. And it's interesting, my role has changed a lot. So I would say in the last year, 80% of my role as performance marketer for Wednesday's Domain has been creative strategy, whereas 12 months ago it was probably 50% media buying and on-platform tactics, and 50% creative strategy. But due to where we are as a business and due to the demands of Meta, you'll hear phrases like creative diversity branded around quite often now. My role has naturally adapted and has had to adapt to meet this change in demand. We launched 74 ads in January, which I realize is somewhat arbitrary of a number, but if we give the context that in the previous 6 months leading up to this January, there was 111 pieces of creative that went live total. It really gives you a sense of how much creative is tied to being able to scale this much. And in fact, if I were to have plotted out how much creative was launched every given month, it would very much mirror the graph that you saw on the previous slides, with this sharp surge, this gradual increase throughout the last 2 years, and then this sharp surge in Jan as well. And I've mentioned then, this is a point we'll come on to a little bit later, 90% of the video, 90% of the ad creative for Wednesday's Domain happens to be video, but that's definitely not a fixed rule. And I think there's definitely times as brand hackers we can do this with static ads and things. So what I don't want people to think is, oh, we need 90% video ad creative to do this. It's just what worked well for Wednesday's Domain. And also we have access to a great pool of creators that fit the brand persona very well, like Claudia, who's in the chat. And so we just really leverage this advantage for Wednesday's Domain too. So digging a little bit deeper into this creative approach, thank you, James. So I guess the main backbone, if I was to really distill down how we're approaching creative strategy, the main backbone is that it's persona led. So by persona, I mean a demographically diverse group of potential consumers who share either lifestyle features or a pain point. So you'll have people of all types of genders, ages, jobs and things within one persona, but it's more of a lifestyle piece. And so we're very much thinking about personas and linking those to pain points as the backbone of creative strategy and our creative brief. So I think importantly what this isn't, and I think when we look at brands that aren't doing creative strategy great on Meta, this is when they take a pain point. So for example, Wednesday's Domain, someone who hates hangovers, and launching that pain point as the whole premise of the ad. But the difficulty with that, and you can see in the example here, that's aimed at every funnel stage and basically everyone. So this is bad for two reasons. One, it doesn't really give Meta much signal as to who you're after, and it makes it very hard for it to learn. But also, if we take a step back and think about reproducible growth over time, even if you launch that ad that's just hates hangovers and it does well, the question you have to ask then is, well, where do we go from here? Do we just keep saying the same message? Whereas, I mean, let's look at example, the second one down here. This is broken up into sober curious people. So they are open to the idea of cutting back on alcohol or maybe going completely sober. In some way, they're engaging with the idea of sobriety. So we've narrowed our niche down already a little bit. Then we've refined it by funnel stage. So they're category aware. So they're familiar that alcohol-free wine is a product category that's available for them. Potentially, they've even tried some competitors. And you can imagine already how that can start to shape the messaging and the angle you're going into the brief with. And then I've written there at the end, from a place of love, that taste knobs exist. So again, so they're category aware. So then we're really going to focus on taste. And all of a sudden, the brief is almost writing itself. You might have tried other alcohol-free wines, but they didn't taste as good as X, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, sorry, James, if you just go to the next slide, please. What's important about doing it the second way is if the majority of your creative is thought out like this, what that means is you have a reproducible, reliable thing to iterate and build upon. The first way can work in some instances. So I'm always a big believer in, this balancing the art and science of paid and having hunches and testing random things here and there. The difficulty is that's not reproducible. So by all means, and we do this with Wednesday's Domain, we'll have a discussion that leads to a bit of inspiration, and we won't necessarily link it to a persona every time. But what's led to that big consistent growth over the last year or so has really been professionalizing and breaking down creative a lot more into personas rather than that spray and pray. So yeah, I alluded to creative diversity a little while ago, and I think especially when speaking to founders or people, I guess, less in the weeds of meta ads, naturally, there's some misconceptions about this. So just to clarify what I mean by creative strategy and how we're thinking about it in the case of Wednesday's Domain, what it isn't is your balance of video and static creatives. You can have 50% video and 50% static in your ad account and have very little creative diversity. What we mean by creative diversity, and we've got some good examples coming up, is this this blending and this, I guess blending is the right word, of visuals, angles, pain points, personas, creators, formats all together, not just formats. So if you go on to the next slide, please, James. I think we have. Yeah, so we've got a good example here. So this is 3 ads that we've ran over the last 6 months or so for Wednesday's Domain. Luke is making an appearance in the middle one, Claudia on the right. So I think initially, if you were to look at this slide, you might think, if I were to ask everyone, you know, how creatively diverse are these pieces of ad creative? There might be a range, but I don't think people would describe these as the most diverse set of creatives. However, the opposite is actually true in terms of the eyes of Andromeda, which is Meta's algorithm and how that works. The first one on the left here is a voiceover, very sensory piece centered around indulgence. It's not personality led, it's more of a, I guess, vibe led creative. There's no faces being shown, and this is also very middle of funnel. The one in the middle is obviously a founder led podcast style ad, so we've got Luke speaking, that passion's coming across, and it's very top of funnel, so it's just introducing who Luke is, who the brand is, but you can obviously see that it's very high production. There's some background music on the non-GIF version. And so this is talking to a completely different subset, and actually it's framed in a very different way. And then on the right-hand side with Claudia's piece, we have very lifestyle-led visuals. It's very relatable, it's very authentic. But actually, this is a very bottom of funnel piece of creative talking about the offer that was running in Dry Jan. So hopefully you can see from there, 3 pieces of video creative, very high in diversity. It wasn't statics that made this diverse at all. And so following on from that, what I think people tend to visualize when they think about creative diversity is very much what we meant by creative diversity, I guess, in 2020, 2021, 2022, which was these small iterative tests. So, okay, just put in our value proposition in this order, work best, or what if we swap the colors here? Now, things like this can work, and I think there's a time and a place for smaller tweaks like this. But when we talk about creative diversity, when we talk about iterations and things, the consensus is, and where we're seeing the results come from more and more, is taking much bigger swings and making much bigger changes. So it's changing creator, it's changing script, angle, shooting style, nature of B-roll, format. I very rarely will brief iterations as small as the ones you can see on the screen nowadays. And I think, given how high the demands are of Meta to have more and more ad creative, I would strongly suggest it's not the best use of time. Ultimately, I think an ad creative has to earn iteration. So if I would not expect any individual one of these to work if they didn't all work, if that makes sense. So next slide, please, James. Which then brings us nicely to creative analysis. So I want to really hone in on this point is in the context that we're all in that we're in startups with somewhat limited resources. Massive companies with big creative teams, obviously different rules are going to apply to them. But I've put the GIF there of you'd be surprised. When I talk about creative analysis and what's helped us iterate and drive the success on Wednesday's Domain, it's not as granular as you'd think. So I've given an example here. I'm not looking at second 16 of video 3 and wondering if the shadow in the corners, you know, these really nuanced, granular things. What I'm talking about when I'm analyzing creative is brilliant. We have our persona, we have our naming convention. This creator is doing well, this angle's doing well, this persona is doing well. We're looking at these bigger, bulkier learnings that we can carry forward. When you have a winner, I think absolutely iterate, tweak the hook, make little subtle changes, but again, I would say not too little. But if you don't have a winning concept, small tweaks are not going to fix it. That would be my advice, and that's how we've approached things here as well. And next slide, please, James. So I mentioned earlier that we launched 74 ads in Jan, 74 pieces of ad creative. Now that might sound like a lot, it might not sound like a lot. It certainly felt like a lot briefing it, but again, what I want to do with this is show you how accessible this approach and this volume of ads is. So I've said that this is a little bit of a hack but it's not really. So again, if you're taking that time that I mentioned to James yesterday, there's a saying about, if you gave me 3 days to sharpen an axe, you should spend you gave me 3 days to chop down a tree, you should spend the first 2 sharpening the axe. That's the saying. That's very much how I would advise people to approach creative strategy. So by starting with a persona, as I said at the time, that creative starts to write itself. You can really see from this example, which I'll go into, that you can get a lot of ad creative from one or few ideas. So for example, if you have something like 3 hooks, 2 pieces of body content, and you want to diversify that across 3 creators, that's already 18 unique pieces of content for you to put live. And so it's not actually as intimidating of a number. The bit that takes the longer time is that pre-work of strategizing, getting learnings over time. But coming into Jan, we had a lot of these learnings, and so it was a matter of doubling down and thinking about pulling different levers like hooks, creators, angles, these kinds of things as well. Next slide, please, James. Yeah, and I've already covered that one. Perfect. So interesting again, and I think in the context of startups and scale-ups, this is really important. What we didn't do for Dry Jan was really over-index on Dry Jan creative. Obviously, when we look at ad platforms and we calculate CAC and return on ad spend, we don't always directly do it, but what should be in the back of your mind as you think about ad creative is also, if you're including the cost of the ads, how effective are they? So if we'd have launched 74 pieces of Dry Jan ad creative, I'm sure that graph could have been even steeper in some ways, but they would naturally be paused after 4, maybe 5 weeks if we'd let it run on a little bit longer. So the return on those creative assets is actually much lower than it seems. And we would have then invested a significant amount of time throughout December and Jan investing in assets that we no longer used afterwards. And so what we didn't want is just a huge spike in sales and then this massive drop off in February. Obviously, there will be a natural drop off after peak, but we wanted to invest in assets, and we wanted to use Dry Jan not as a quick spike on a graph, but actually like a place to gather momentum to set us off into the year strongly. So we didn't overcommit to peak is the long and short of this slide. Just remembering what I put here. Just go back 1 second, James. Actually, there's a good point on this one. What I would recommend, so again, ads, they have the learning phase that they take time to get momentum and grow and scale. So what I would actually advise, and what we did more so, because obviously mentioned less than 20 of our ad creators were actually Dry Jan specific. What I would really advise leaning into Dry Jan on is the touch points and channels that don't require momentum in the same way. So obviously a website banner, very easy to change. Email flows, I don't always write them, so I don't want to make them sound too easy, but much easier to change. You can switch between them. These touch points, I would recommend leaning way more into Dry Jan there and not over-indexing on these seasonal peaks for Meta. Thank you, James. And again, the caveat is we haven't always approached things like this with Wednesday's Domain, and not everyone needs to approach creative strategy to the same degree. Some people will need to pursue it a lot more, some people less. But what's really important to encapsulate is you could see from that graph at the start, we didn't always approach creative strategy like this. So depending on the level you are and how far you are in your meta ads journey or your growth journey, you're going to want to approach things very differently. So do you need a huge creative matrix with 20 personas, pain points, workflow? Definitely not if you're brand new to meta ads. But I think it's the LinkedIn effect, right? You scroll on LinkedIn and it seems like everyone's doing these great things, but actually if you're starting out, you actually just need to start with some hypothesis, some resources, and within the resources you have. And again, this comes back to the video static debate. Even if video was more profitable for your business, but you have very limited resources and you're spending £50 per day on meta ads, in the long term, video isn't going to perform better for you because you won't be able to produce enough to double down on those learnings. So you've got to think about things really holistically. And then I've written there as well, the meta of meta. So meta meaning most effective tactics available. So again, we didn't approach things like this with Wednesday's Domain 2 years ago because meta wasn't as creatively demanding and as creatively driven 2 years ago as the way it is today. So the message there is just really stay on top of and up to date with what's going on the platforms, or speak to people who are in the platforms day to day. Thank you, James. So yeah, I just wanted to end on, I guess, a couple of myths that I think are worth busting, and some things we definitely didn't do, or that people may think mattered to this growth but didn't. And then we'll finish on some silver bullets, so some things I think we really had in our favor that allowed us to get this level of growth. So I've written there, scaling does not just mean increasing your budget. I know that might sound obvious to some people, but I'm going to refer back to the really nice graph at the beginning. The reason that spike didn't come sooner was demonstrative of the fact that scaling doesn't just mean increasing your budget. So for every X increase in budget, you're going to have to widen your amount of creative by X percentage as well. And that number will be different for every brand and every person running meta ads. But what's important to think is, if I want to double my ad spend in the next year, does my creative pipeline, does my creative resource enable that, or am I setting myself up for skyrocketing CPAs essentially? A lot of founders or people who maybe are managing teams that aren't directly in the weeds of meta ads, I hear very often tales of them getting on the phone with their meta rep, which is like a person from Meta who calls you talking about how to optimize your account. No disrespect by this at all, but I think it's really important to take their advice with a pinch of salt. I definitely think sometimes people can get spooked, but what's important to remember, and James and I were speaking about this yesterday, a lot of what they consider best practice is best practice taken from the work of big brands with big ad spends, big creative teams. They're getting large amounts of data, which means Meta can work really well. It's got huge sample sizes. It can do all the calculations it needs. It can optimize really well. For startups or people spending less on Meta, what's best practice for Nike isn't best practice for Wednesday's Domain, I guess, is the main takeaway. So don't be spooked if they call you with a bunch of ideas in the middle of the night. They're not always the best. And then just visiting it again, I feel like I've made the point clear here, but there's no perfect blend of video and static. In an ideal world, be testing both and follow what works with both. But if you don't have the resource to make video, that doesn't mean you can't succeed on Meta. And some brands, like if you look at Loop earphones, they're really pushing a lot of scale on Meta, and by the looks of things, I'd say 60-70% of their ads are statics. So it's about taking what you can do and making it work for you. And on to the silver bullets. I think one thing that really allowed us to succeed on Wednesday's Domain so far is our relationship with Luke, in that Luke is very engaging in terms of the strategic questions he asks and the things he brings to the table. And he really will ask us challenging questions and challenge our thinking and try and inspire us to think outside of the box and things. But what Luke really, and I can't see Luke, but I hope he's smiling, what Luke really doesn't do is micromanage. So I think you hear stories sometimes of, maybe there's a growth exec in your team and maybe you're the founder and you're challenging every little decision that they make. And depending on their skill level, maybe they'll need that. But what was really helpful with Wednesday Domain, I was never putting out the fire of Luke. Luke trusted me, and he allowed me to kind of do my thing to an extent, and that builds this mutual communication pathway. And so there wasn't an aspect of my limited one day sending Luke huge messages to get him off my back. He would ask a question and we would talk about it, but it was really constructive, I guess is the point there. James made fun of me for the next point because I really tried to make like an acronym thing, so I hope everyone likes it. But I said keep it commercial kindly. So linking back to the last point, actually, I think the best meta ad strategies are led by people who are really understanding what's going on outside of meta ads. So for a long time now, me and Luke have had pretty open dialogue about the commercials, so about what's going on in terms of investment, profit margins, unit economics. And these just make decision making in the platform way easier. It's a lot easier to understand. If Luke's in a growth phase where growth is a priority, or a profitability phase, that will very much affect how we're approaching meta. And so just keeping things commercial and having those really direct, shrinking the gap between the person running the meta ads and the person sorting out the P&L, I think is really important. And then if you just go on to the next slide, James, just for this last point, this is an apology to brand teams. But yeah, I think with meta ads, ultimately taking down brand guardrails to an extent, I don't want to see a lot of panicked faces there, is really important. So there are definitely ads that we run for Wednesday's Domain that wouldn't always be on the website front page or the pinned post on the Instagram. And again, there'll be phases when we care more about this and phases where we don't. But importantly, you have to have slightly more leeway on paid because you need to follow the data, and performance data and brand don't always agree, obviously. And definitely, especially for a brand like Wednesday's Domain, which is so visual, brand and things like this are really important. So it's a balance of both, but I would always advise people to not be as strict with brand guidelines, etc. On paid, which I believe brings us to my last slide. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully that was useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jean-Luc. That was super helpful. And we've got some questions coming in the chat, which I will come to make sure that we get to those in time. Luke, I guess, Jean-Luc's been through, the process that we've, the evolution of our work with you over the last year. He's gone into some details, some technicals, and some kind of in the weeds. From, I guess, the question I'd have for you, which I think is pretty useful for other founders in the online here, is how do you approach D2C in terms of your wider business, in terms of the makeup of it and how it affects how big a part of your kind of work is it? In the sense of it's obviously a decent chunk of revenue, but you're also, you've got a trade business, you're in, an Ocado, you have other parts of the business. So how do you look at D2C? And you kind of alluded to it slightly at the start, but, versus the rest of the business. And then actually on that point around brand and, and performance and ads, obviously, you're a brand focused founder. I think that's always been the way. How do you feel about that kind of slight tension sometimes between what you want to go out on your, you've got this beautiful table talk email that goes out, you've got very nicely curated grid and Instagram and those sort of things, and then you've got ads that are doing sort of different things. So I guess I'm almost looking at it from a mindset perspective, that mindset that Jean-Luc alludes to, where you're comfortable kind of giving them, some leeway to sort of do their thing. What advice would you give to other founders on that? Because obviously it's spending money every day, right? So it's something that it's quite a hard mindset to get into, of like, okay, trust the process and actually trust that it may not be exactly what I would normally do on the brand side.
Yeah, I think two really interesting questions. For me, D2C is, it's a very big part of what we do as a business. It probably holds more weight within our revenue and our sales mix than it might in 2 or 3 years. And if you look at a kind of financial model, as you get more distribution in the physical world, as such, as you get into certain supermarkets, then as a proportion of your total revenue, it probably goes down. But it is a massive, massive part of what we're doing. And I really firmly believe that we've barely even scratched the surface. I think the way that I tend to think about the business is almost, sprint is the wrong word, but it's like, what do I care about now? What's the most pressing opportunity or the most pressing problem? I'm going to focus on that. And I think 18 months ago, as you've touched upon, when we had that coffee, naturally as a founder, I spend my whole day just having coffees, not doing any work, obviously. It was very much, we're kind of doing this, we're kind of not doing it, like, let's commit. And once we got all that in place, I could then step away from it because I had a lot of trust in what Jean-Luc and Lauren and the team were doing there. Recently, we've begun looking at it more closely again, which has been really, after this phase of scaling, we're like, right, we need to get back into some of the weeds of all this. So I think it plays a key role, but I want to have good people around me that I can trust to do something. In terms of brand and releasing the reins around brand guidelines, Jean-Luc, you touched upon me being relatively hands-off and trusting. Meta ads are a weird one because I actually don't see 90% of what we put out there. I don't even have Instagram as a personal account. I do have it, but I haven't logged into it for years. So I see none of this stuff. And actually, my view is just one person's view, and I see the world through my own eyes, which are very different to someone else's eyes. I would say 2/3 plus of our customer base are 30 to 40-year-old females, of which I'm not one. So what resonates with those individuals might be different to what resonates with me. And so actually I'm relatively trusting of those decisions to drive creative diversity, and ultimately the market decides. What you're doing is put a load of stuff out there, some will work, some won't, and you find out pretty quick. And that's not often the ones that work aren't always the ones that you think will work before you put them out. So that's how I kind of see it, I would say. I'm conscious of stopping there because there's so many other questions that have come through.
So I'm gonna go to the chat to make sure. So Tom, who's MD of Good and Property, has a question. I think probably a good one for you, actually, Luke. Here. So do you guys work to a target CAC, and what payback period is this based on? Has it changed and evolved as you scaled? So question actually to add on to that is who drives the CAC target? Is it you, Luke, or is it Lauren or Jean-Luc? How does that work?
Yeah, Tom, so to answer your question, yes, we do work to a CAC target. That is based on an understanding of our cost of goods, and it's also based on an understanding of the role that the channel plays within the business. So in terms of resources, we're not bootstrapped, but we don't have loads and loads of cash. So the way that we look at it is we need to be achieving first order profitability. And first order profitability goes all the way down to zero. If we're break even on a first order, I'm okay with that. There are also times where we're willing to sit the wrong side of that line if it's in a period of kind of high intent or demonstrable acquisition opportunities like Christmas, like Dry Jan. Your CACs actually go down in those periods, so they're a bad example, but or in our case. But yeah, that's how I tend to think about it. And interestingly, as a business, we're now saying, okay, we know we can acquire customers at scale with a pretty consistent CAC. How do we focus on really then growing that lifetime value? Because if you do that and you have more data around that, actually you can be more aggressive with your CAC. You can say, okay, we can afford to sit the wrong side of that first order profitability if we know we're getting a decent proportion of those people back, and we're playing a lifetime value game versus a first order profitability game.
Okay, I'm gonna whilst we're staying on CAC, I'm gonna ask this question. I think it might be a Jean-Luc question, but either way, from Millie. So how do you calculate your CAC? Do you look at total ad spend to all new customer orders, or do you use the meta attribution? I think the question there is basically, do you trust what Meta's telling you, or actually do you do it a different way?
Yeah, so in the day-to-day, so we have Klaviyo linked with Meta, so there's a pretty up-to-date live feed of new customers pulling into Meta at all times. So in terms of my, I guess, little siloed approach when I'm in Meta ads every day, that's the answer to that. But then, as Luke alluded to, we've got the wider team of Laura and Luke, and we have broader reports where we're looking at things on a more blended basis, anywhere from blended CAC, factoring in organic channels to actual new customers that Shopify reports. So there's a couple of levels we're looking at it from, essentially.
Yeah, I would answer that. Jean-Luc and I probably look at it in a slightly different way. I look at it purely on a blended basis, and that is down on a personal level, down to headspace and capacity to think about these things. There was also a question earlier around kind of channel mix and all that sort. And if we do use other channels, we actually looked for a little while, but I'd say probably 6 months to a year ago, when TikTok Shop was blowing up and everyone was saying, if you're not on TikTok, you're an idiot, and TikTok is Instagram 5 years ago, all that sort of stuff. And we tried to repurpose some content and it just didn't work. And what we were realizing was that, similar to a point I made earlier, we're nowhere near hitting the ceiling of Meta. So actually just double down on what's working rather than creating distractions through secondary channels.
Yeah, I remember hearing a talk from the founders of Surreal, the head of growth at Surreal, and he said that exact same point. He said most brands give up on Meta way too early, and they go and spread their cost across other platforms like TikTok or Google or anything like that. And you've got so much more ceiling and headroom in Meta than people always think.
Just on that as well, someone asked a question about attribution and linking multi-channel to attribution. The other headache that comes from launching on more than one paid channel as well, and obviously there are some advantages to it, but you have to spend a lot more time looking at things in a lot more of a granular way. Obviously, Luke just alluded to headspace and looking at things blended. It makes looking at the data a lot more simple. We're not having to think about incrementality tests in the same way, or spend money on platforms like Triple Whale to understand the true contribution of different channels. So it does also simplify like higher up decision making too.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about tests. So Hughes asked, what have been the most successful tests? Were they surprising? And do we do any whitelisting, or is that a part of the approach?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think you captured it well, Luke, in terms of us both not being 30 to 40-year-old females, which are the bulk of our customer base. It's very interesting as things have grown a lot more into creative strategy. It's been an interesting challenge for me to get in the mind of the consumers who aren't necessarily me, and so it won't be a surprise to Luke, because we've always known that foodies and wine lovers overlap in this way. But it's funny, we have one piece of creative that every time we make an iteration of, if I change any variable away from the fact that it's about cooking, it does not perform. So it's not necessarily a surprise, but I think it's interesting. I can try and recreate the same reel across different creators, take out the cooking element. This reel does not perform at all. So actually how intrinsically and how really like tangible like the persona work is, that some people are only interested in this in the context of sipping a glass of wine whilst cooking. And so that is one of those examples where it does get really granular. And in terms of whitelisting, we haven't done any whitelisting today. It is in future plans.
You just want to quickly explain what whitelisting is, just in it.
Yes, of course. So yeah, if anyone goes on Instagram often, you'll see people on organic do a lot of collaboration posts. So you might see an influencer's name mixed with a brand's name. I think Tala do a lot of this. It's the only brand coming to mind at the minute, but Tala do a lot of this. And so essentially it's running an ad. You can either do it as both the brand and the content creator / influencer, or just as the influencer. And what this does is obviously you leverage their likeness, their social proof, the trust of their audience. So it's kind of influencers meeting paid, but something that's really helpful for kind of unlocking new audiences and gathering what we call like net new reach, which is basically new audiences, is you can leverage their following in your targeting as well. So it means if you think a creator has a certain persona that really resonates with your product, you can really tap into a not a warm audience, but an audience that's really going to resonate with the product, I guess.
Yeah, and put some paid behind their post.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about content creators, because I think this is really hard for brands, and look, we find this hard, even as an agency where we have a lot of creators on our books. So Lee's asked any tips on finding the right creators for your brand. One of you guys, I'm not sure which, would take that, and then a sort of a relevant question from Ellen: in testing content creators, how much would you commit to, or how long would you work with them to test effectiveness? So there's an element of just kind of understanding kind of how a creator is the one, and sometimes you have to kiss a lot of frogs.
Yeah, I'd like to say there's a super sexy answer to finding and testing content creators. Ultimately, it's platforms like Twirl that have a good database of creators. It's asking in places like Community, the World Community, and that network effect. That's mostly how we've done it. A lot of people have either come through personal contacts, recommendations, and then when we find someone that we really like working with, we really nurture that relationship. Like I'm in Claudia's email inbox probably weekly at this point, but initially, going to the second part of that question, I'll tend to test, I guess, 3 pieces of creative. So I'll say, hey James, you're a content creator, I think you'll work great for Wednesday's Domain. And what I tend to do, actually, this is potentially useful with a new creator. I think I do not test brand new blue sky ideas creatively, because then ultimately it's how do I know what's working here? So I tend to look with a first interaction of a new creator, I'm using them to iterate on an already winning idea and concept and add to that diversity, which actually makes it much easier to know if they're going to work out.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. I'm going to ask one more question from the chat. Briefly, it's a general question: would you run geo-targeted meta ads for brands that are in retail and want to drive conversions? Because I think that's actually a question I get so much: is it worth running ads to try and get people into a Tesco, or actually is it not? And then I want to just ask Luke one more question, just more of a sort of general kind of holistic point.
To the Tesco and I guess like sales driving, sales uplift perspective, there's a lot of like questions I would need to ask in terms of ifs. So again, what is the cost of using that budget for that? Are there any other promotions going on? Like ultimately it comes down to like, how do you make that measurable? So I really don't want to put any, it's why I'm not huge on awareness campaigns for startups. It's if I'm spending X, like how can I tangibly know the return? And obviously the further you get between the ad and the conversion, the more difficult that is. And so I've consulted brands before that have asked about this, and I always recommend you try and at least do as controlled of an experiment as you can. So if there's two really similar towns where your product is listed in the same way, surge ads to one and not the other. But even then, there's so many variables like traffic or things that can affect it. So you can do it, but I would really advise think about measurability is that word, and also the cost of using that. Where is it better spent in store, for example?
Just on that point, Jill, I also think there's probably a relation to the scale of spend that you're already at. So we have no presence in UK physical retail, but I suspect that if we did, as and when we do get into physical retail, that we will receive benefits from the volume of ads that we're already running.
Yeah.
In contrast, we're listed in kind of 550 Albert Heijn stores across the Netherlands and Belgium. And when we launched there, we ran some ads. I suspect not a single person purchased a bottle in Albert Heijn because they'd seen a meta ad. And that's because we weren't running them at any meaningful scale. We were coming from a cold start. And so it was almost pointless, I would say. So again, I think it relates back to where you're at as a brand, level of spend already, and level of brand awareness that exists at that point in time.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And Luke, I guess question I get from founders is how do you make that decision to really dedicate and double down into one channel like D2C, and even further into Meta? Maybe not into Meta, that's maybe more of a technical question, but you had that kind of that thought process, and it seems to be working and it's been great. What advice would you give to founders or marketers on the call who are wanting to make that decision but are a little bit nervous and just don't quite know almost like what to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'd maybe think about it through the context of how many different decisions and big calls you're making on a semi-regular basis. There are things that I was focusing so much time on 6 months ago that I can barely remember now. We were looking at whether or not we were looking at some different distribution options, and we decided it wasn't the right call for us, and now it's not a thing. And D2C could have easily gone that way. Okay, 18 months ago, I wanted to put more energy into D2C. We're going to see how far we could take it. And quite feasibly, it could have not worked, and we wouldn't be having this conversation now. So I think, you have hunches. Those hunches are backed by some level of data, some level of guesswork, and then you put some resource behind it and see what happens. Some of them work, some of them don't. This is one that worked. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess looking forward, with your strategy hat on, do you envisage this is only going to get bigger in terms of D2C and keep that focus? Or let's say Tesco come along and you do get a listing there and a Waitrose, do you suddenly have to sort of move some of your attention, budget, and all this sort of thing across, and it may look different in 6 months' time? That's not too hypothetical. I think ultimately it comes down to, I've said it a few times, I don't think we're anywhere near the ceiling of D2C. I think getting a listing in one or two retailers doesn't materially change that. I think if you're a business in full retail distribution, if you're in every single supermarket in the UK, D2C is probably less relevant, and you're probably better off assigning ad spend into retailers or trade spend or whatever you want to refer to it as. But for us, it's absolutely a focus. And I think the good thing about D2C is it's guided by the numbers. So if the numbers stack up, you keep doing it. And that's my big mindset shift, which is viewing meta ads not as a cost, but as an investment that actually pays back pretty quickly and pretty obviously. You can tie the input to the output. So for me, it's kind of, yeah, let's keep rolling with it as long as it's working.
Fantastic. Yeah, amazing. Love that. Thanks so much for your time, Luke. Really appreciate you and coming on, being so candid and transparent, and really appreciate it. Anything you want to plug coming up for Wednesday's Domain, other than just the amazing, lovely wines that you have? People should just check out.
I think everyone's already left anyway. So yeah, wednesdaysdomain.com. That's the best place to find the wines. And thank you all for taking the time to listen.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Luke. Thanks, Jean-Luc. We will be back next month with our next talk, which I'll send some details for. But thanks so much, everybody, for spending your lunch break with us. We'll be in touch. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Cheers. Bye bye.